you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Folks, Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The Iron Lady sings and that makes it official. Welcome to the big show. We have an amazing young man we're going to be talking to today about some of his insights, his stories, his lessons of life that you can use to maybe make your life better, because that's what we do here on the Chris Voss Show. Help make people you know's lives better. For the show to your family, friends, and relatives, go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss1 on the TikTok, and all those crazy places in the internet. Today, our young man we have joining us on the show is Griff Ruby. He's getting younger the more times I say it, I think. His book is entitled The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, a Guide to Traditional Catholic Community, out September 26, 2002. You can check out his book wherever fine books are sold and all that good stuff. So we're going to get into it with him, find out more about his life and his journey, etc., etc. Mr. Griff Ruby was born in 1958. He found the faith without the luxury of a religious upbringing and at a time when Catholicism itself had lost its identity. His writings reflect many years of research into the Christian history and theology and ecclesiology. He lives with his wife, Juliet, and son, Martin, on the Central California coast. Welcome to the show. How are you, Griff?
Well, I guess I'm very well.
There you go. Yeah, you're on the Chris Voss Show.
Hey, I'm on the Chris Voss Show.
There you go. So give us your .coms. Where can people find out more about you on the interwebs?
.coms. Well, right now, I think the best place just to find the access to the book, because the only site I have is very old, and it was to promote the book, more than like 10, 15 years ago. So actually more like 20 now. But the idea was to promote stuff, but it's still the old HTTP protocol, and a lot of modern browsers have a problem with that. So I don't know that I have that site. The best places to find me, to find my book, the easiest place would be on Amazon, because Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church and also my other book title, Sede Vacante, is on Amazon under my name, Griff Ruby. The other place that I like to put stuff in where people can post comments is that on YouTube I have a channel called Mr. Ubi Petrus. And Ubi Petrus is just a run together of two words in Latin to say where Peter is. So that's probably the best ways to access me as far as it may be my publisher has a site too, but I don't remember it off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. So in the show, give us a 30,000 overview of the book and what's inside.
Okay, 30,000 foot overview. Now, this is kind of the big item, actually. You see, the claim that I make in here is a very large scale claim. And it may sound out there when you first hear it, but as you see it defended and as you see how this works out, it is really something that is important for, certainly everyone who is concerned, let us say, with following Christ really should know about all of this. I think people get this idea of religion as kind of this blob that you can kind of make anything of it you want. You can have the like one of those Rorschach ink blot tests, that psychologists would use. And one person says, oh, it's a butterfly. And someone else says, oh, it's two young girls dancing, blah, 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 whatever. And of course, what somebody sees, and it doesn't really tell us anything about the ink blast, but about the mindset and psychology of the person seeing whatever they see. But when it comes to religion, there really is more than that. God created a church Jesus Christ did a lot of things. We know that he wandered around Jerusalem. We know that he preached all these wonderful sermons. We know that he worked these miracles. We know that he came back from the dead. And if we understand the Christian gospel, even at its barest rudiments, we understand that he was crucified for our sins, came back from the dead 3 days later, and ultimately ascended into heaven and so forth. So we know these things, but there's something else he did that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and that is he founded a church. Once you watch for him doing that, there's actually a lot of that scattered throughout the New Testament. He's picking its leaders, the apostles, and how the succession goes. And he's really showing how everything is done and explaining a lot of it. A lot of the parables pertain to growing the church. So it isn't a subjective thing. And I came across this illusion, and some people have seen this on the internet. If you're just listening to this, you can Google the phrase cigar in brick wall, because here's this picture. I don't know how clear we can get this. And it shows a brick wall, and there's this little bit of white stuff that looks like a rock stuck in the crack between the bricks. When I first saw it, that's what I thought it was. And I thought, well, what's the big deal? But there are people who say, well, no, there's a cigar in the picture. Do you see any cigar?
Not really.
Well,
but
okay.
I mean, it's not the great picture.
Okay. Yeah, well, I could be part of it. But the other thing is, the cigar actually lines up perfectly with one of the cracks in the bricks. And it actually sticks in between here, and it's sticking out, and the camera just lined it just perfectly. So that actually that little rock-like thing is actually the tip of the cigar. Yeah. So I was like, once you see, oh, yeah, that is a cigar. If you look closely, you can almost figure out, well, I don't think it's a Cuban cigar, but, you can almost figure out what cigar it is if you know cigars, which I don't. But, it is a real cigar. But it's blended in so nicely that, when I saw it first, and obviously even as you still see it now, it just looks like there's a brick wall and there's this little rock stuck between a couple of bricks. But so is this a subjective thing? Is it just, well, some people think they see just a brick wall with a rock in the crack, and other people think they see a cigar. And if you don't know, if you haven't pointed out, you can say to yourself, well, I don't know why anyone would say that they see a cigar. I don't know what they're talking about. But once you see the cigar and you picked it out with your mind and you pierced it out and go, oh my God, it is a cigar. And the big thing is, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So those of us who have seen the cigar will never be persuaded that it was simply, even I myself had thought it was before I saw the cigar. In other words, it's an objective reality. And church is like that. Christ didn't just kind of mouth some nice things and, people kind of want to remember our good friend Jesus and write up some gospels. He wanted them to write these gospels. He wanted there to be a church, and he wanted that church to continue with a specific chain of authority that has continued through the bishops and the popes and leaders of the church from then until now. Excuse me. So he wanted that. Now, here's the thing. Most people, probably about, you said I'm young. I'm well into my 60s. I'll leave it at that. But younger generations may probably have seldom seen the Catholic Church unless they know or are in the traditional Catholic community, because it's still kind of small and scattered. It's scattered kind of almost uniformly in many different parts of the world, and maybe to varying degrees what people have to do as far as whether they've got clergy to support them commonly or not and things like that. But it's a large group. Millions and millions of us, but it's very scattered, and you find you can go for a lot of times and never not find it, because there's all these buildings that says Catholic Church, and here's the big shocker. It's just plain not. The Catholic Church of history has had over 1900 years from Pentecost until Vatican II to document what it is, what it believes, what it teaches, how it operates, and what things to trust and what things not to trust. And it's very, very, very detailed. The theological manuals, especially from those older days, really get into a lot of detail. But that's for another book. I'm more interested in the history in this book, which is to say there were Catholics who grew up in the Catholic Church as it was up until Vatican II. Mm-hmm. And then they see everything go crazy. And they're wondering what is going on. And they, just crazy thing after crazy thing. And they're always being promised, oh, this will be the last. And then something else comes along. Yeah, that's even crazier. Oh, we'll never tolerate communion in the hand. Then they do. We'll never tolerate having altar girls. Then they do. Then they say, well, we'll always make sure that we don't allow people who don't believe in our basic beliefs. Frank Sheed wrote a book back in 1967, published in 1968, called Is It the Same Church? Now, he's kind of trying to defend that somehow, despite having changed its aspect already by then so dramatically, that somehow it's still the same church. The problem is he's trying to say, well, now, if it can do this thing, that shouldn't matter. And maybe he's right, maybe he's not. But if it does this other more extreme thing, that cannot be the church. Well, and he does that at least a couple times that I've documented, and maybe others. And he's done this and said this. And what happened is exactly he said the thing that couldn't happen has happened. It's routine. So, he wanted to say, yeah, it's the same church, but the very test he set up for it actually provide that the answer to that question is a resounding no. It is not the same church. This is not just a matter of commentary either. So, I think of a woman looking at the fat, balding specimen of a man who won't get up from the couch just to carry out the garbage, and he says, "You're not the man I married." Well, obviously, of course, he is the same man. He's just lost that fervor he once had when they were courting. So, but rather, it's more like what happened when this happened to a young single mother in Los Angeles about 1928 or so. She was raising this young boy by herself. She had to have a job to support them. And the boy would be in school. He's a school-aged boy. And she comes home one day and he's not there, not with any of her friends. She can't find him. And she calls the police, and they'll start looking for him, missing person. Well, after some weeks or something, they bring back the boy, and they say, here you are. We're all happy. There you are. Take a nice picture in front of the train where we brought him. There you are, standing next to your son, happily reunited. Smile for the camera, please. But she thought, wait a minute, this isn't my son. Now, come on, let's get over this. Oh, wow. As if he's so changed. It's the movie called Changeling. They made that. If you ever care to look it up, it's a neat movie too. And you'll just be, But anyway, she's trying to, this is not my son. Well, look, he's been through a lot of adventures that can really change a person, and we don't know. Maybe we'll learn as he can open up about what adventures he's been through since he's been missing all this time, and so on, as if that's the only problem. But it really is a different boy. She was keeping marks on her doorstop or something of how tall her son is. This boy is 3 inches shorter than the last mark she made. He does not have the same dental records as her son at his dentist, where she would routinely have been taking her son. This boy goes back to the same classroom where her son had started the school year and was still there with the same teacher. And the teacher says to you, take your seat. And the kid just sits down in some empty seat he finds. And she has to explain to him, no, I didn't just say take a seat. Take your seat. He didn't know what seat it was because it's not the same one. It's a different boy. And the police, there's a lot of other intense stuff that happens. That's kind of, they think the lady's crazy. They lock her up and all this kind of stuff. I don't know who's looking after this boy they brought her while that's going on. But anyway, we never find out what happened to her actual son, you see, because the principal thing is, if that has simply been her son, you can solve it with just some more counseling and therapy to help mother and son get together. But since this is really a different boy, there's a gigantic loose end, namely somewhere out there is her son. He may be dead, he may be alive, and now because they think they've found this boy for her, there's no need to search anymore. Now, this is what we really have. If this society run from the Vatican City for a long time, really since Vatican II onward, isn't the church, you say, it doesn't mean that church has disappeared. It means that the church continues, as it were, kind of like underground. And that gets to why I want to call the book The Resurrection. It's not that the church has actually died. It has not. But rather, this is from a nice old catechism, This is the Faith, by Canon, Ripley. His name is Ripley. I forget the rest of his name, but he's called Canon for some reason. But he had a little quote in here, and he says, primarily, the church is not an organization. She is the continuance of the work of a divine person. She will never fail simply because Christ can never fail. For every Calvary will be followed by a fresh resurrection. So Vatican II has been her biggest Calvary since. And the traditional Catholic movement is that resurrection. It's that resurrection life preserving what everyone would have thought would be destroyed, and many thought simply was destroyed. And you can go along with this destruction and pretend that this very changed society is somehow still the church. That would be like the lady faking it. Oh yeah, this is my boy. Like maybe this will help her get out of the insane asylum.
There you go.
But we all know that's a lie, and they can tell she's not telling what she really believes, so she doesn't get out yet.
There you go.
Or we can be honest about it and just realize that there are those faithful priests and bishops who saw this nonsense. They didn't understand it. They couldn't explain it, but they just do. They had to stick with what they had been ordained to do, to teach, to believe. All of that. They stuck with that. And at first it was just some faithful priest here and some faithful priest there and a very tiny handful of bishops, but they wanted to keep on doing what they had been ordained, and in the case of bishops, consecrated to do. And of course, sooner or later, they'd get persecuted for this. They'd get kicked out of their parishes. And you know what they do? They set up shop somewhere else, maybe starting with some rented space. And later on, they eventually would be able to have some small chapel built for themselves and their congregations. And many of their congregation kind of went with them rather than staying in the same building with whatever, they replaced them with. And from this comes a whole grand, large community. Sometimes I've called it a movement because it's not a movement like we're changing or moving from one place to another, but it is like a movement in the standpoint of, we are active. We have things to accomplish. Christ gave his church a mission. We have that mission. We have that obligation. So that is the big picture. It's a shocking thing, but at the same time, it's really the explanation needed. All through the 60s and 70s, when every time you went to church, what have they done this time? Oh my God, what the heck is this? You say, why are they doing all this? Well, the real reason for all these changes is that was their way of telling the whole world, we're not Catholics anymore. That was the real point of all the changes that they were making all the time, from what had been to what is now, from the Latin Mass to this other vernacular thing, which, by the way, the content of the prayers has been changed substantially. Whole doctrines just knocked out that are in the classic, saint and so forth, just gone. And then this new thing is like, have a nice day. Let's all be nice people and so forth. And, any church can tell you that. I mean, even things that aren't churches can tell you that, the else, or you name it. You see, but Christ wanted to deliver something greater to mankind, his righteousness, his holiness. And once you see it, you don't forget it. It's like that cigar. You may convince yourself not to want to think about it, but you really can't truly unsee what you saw. And that's what I'm thinking. I mean, okay, that's a big 30,000 foot view, but this book really is some of the background, what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen, what are some of the evidences of what had changed, and then I finally dive into the actual history of these individual priests and bishops laity and so forth, who are gradually, like the ship is sunk, but we have a little raft here and a couple more people swim to this raft, and maybe another people have a raft, and we can tie the rafts together, and bit by bit we're kind of trying to pick up the pieces of the survivors from what few people have managed to stay afloat when the rest of the ship went down. It's kind of like that. And so you kind of feel the pieces kind of coming together. A very prominent bishop that I write about is Archbishop Lefebvre. He was very famous for his Latin Mass and the whole priest that he trained. And then when he consecrated some bishops back in 1988, that was actual news. And they were saying, oh, wow, he's a schismatic, he's excommunicated. And no, he's not actually. Technically, I examined the case in some detail. And for that matter, who's trying to excommunicate it has no right or authority to do that, because they are no longer the church. They've made that point very clear with all the changes they've made. And it's time to just read the room, Read the room.
Read the room.
Ask away.
So let me clarify some things. So for those people who don't know stuff, let's set some definitions. What is the Vatican II? You've referenced that several times.
It's a council that was organized.
Okay.
A whole bunch of there were already some corrupt churchmen, but they couldn't do very much. But when they got in this council called Vatican II, every now and then the church would organize these councils, and when they do this, there's a reason for a council. For example, when Protestantism was a big problem, they called together the Council of Trent. You've probably heard of that. There was other things like kind of atheism and irreligion and indifferentism, and they brought together the First Vatican Council in 1869-70. And they confirmed, for one thing, the doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope and so forth. And then we get to this next one. There was no particular reason that the council was being called. I mean, okay, communism was fashionable. Maybe they could have called the council to condemn that, but they'd already agreed in advance not to. So it's like, what are we doing this for? All these people went there and gathered because they were bishops and priests and cardinals and so forth. They all went to Vatican City and they sat there and heard all these blather documents that just really terrible. You read on it, what did I just read? And it was really bad.
Yeah.
And they signed off all stuff. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah.
They signed off on this stuff thinking, well, it doesn't say anything, so it doesn't matter if I sign off. Well, some of it did say some things that definitely did change some things and so forth. And I talk about some of that in this book, and in my set of Vacante books, I'll drill into that a whole lot more. But the whole point is, it wasn't a real council. I mean, yeah, a real church went in, and basically two churches came out of it. A bogus one that had managed to appropriate 99% or something of the former church's resources. And then there's the true church continuing on quietly, faithful in the background, probably in many ways underground, and especially in certain parts of the world, and unacknowledged, almost unknown, except for those involved or meeting up with it personally. So, yeah. Sorry, ask away.
So you talked about why is Latin Mass important, and how does that work into what you've discussed so far?
Well, there's two things about the Mass in Latin. The original, they call it Tridentine because they officially codified it as late as the Council of Trent. But it has been the Mass literally from persecution under ancient Rome times, once they were really able to have enough peace and quiet to kind of formulate what are we going to do as we worship. But they pretty well knew. But there, Justin Martyr has a description that's kind of simplistic, but it absolutely agrees with what we do. But it goes on to today, it's just not very detailed. But as the years go by, there's sacramentaries that tell us exactly what the Mass was, and it really had barely changed. What really had happened was, as the Protestants were gaining more influence, even Catholic priests, many of whom weren't very well trained, were sometimes yielding to pressure from their local Protestant communities. And so that was when the Pope, Pius V, had to kind of lay down the law and say, no, we don't do that. This is what we need to do. We need to train our priests a lot better than we had been. And they started doing that. And we need to let people know what they should and shouldn't be doing as they're conducting a mass or any of the various other ceremonies and sacraments and so forth at the church. So they did that, and that's what that was important for.
There you go. The other question I had for you was, what is the sacramental validity and why does it matter?
Okay. Well, validity has to do with whether or not the sacrament really worked. Okay, take a simple one like baptism. It really doesn't take much to do a valid baptism. Basically, the baptized herb has to be somebody other than the baptizee. You can't baptize yourself. Also, they have to be a human being with the use of reason. So it won't do any good to try to get baptized by a small child or by a trained chimpanzee or by a robot. It has to be a human being with the use of reason. And then Christ has the words. You can say that in whatever language, as long as within that language you are saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as you're pouring the water. And you cover their forehead at least. And you can cover more, that's okay. But the forehead, which is what required, is kind of a bare minimum. You say, you have baptized that person. Now, here's the thing. Let's say you didn't do it right. If you didn't use water, you used Coca-Cola. It won't be valid. Let's say you decide to say, well, I'm going to baptize you in the name of Jesus. No, that won't work. See, when Scripture actually lays down specifically what to say, then you really pretty much got to say exactly that. There's not a lot of wiggle room there. Sometimes in some sacraments, there's a little more room for flexibility, like, say, confirmation and so forth. But there still has to be the same essential content of whatever you say, whatever you intend, whoever you are, because the baptism is the easiest in terms of the minister. Well, the only one that's easy is marriage, because who confects the sacrament of matrimony isn't the priest or anybody else saying, you're now kiss the bride and all this. It's actually the man and the woman saying their I do's to each other. That is the sacrament of matrimony. Once they've done that, assuming neither one of them's already married to somebody else or other such prohibitions, it's done. They're married. And that's a sacrament. Otherwise, all you have is at best maybe a legal contract, which actually in the Catholic Church, that's not considered acceptable or right and won't even count. Among non-Catholics, you can be a little more leeway. So a couple of Buddhists, go to the justice of the peace to have a wedding between themselves. They're married too, regardless of whether it's a sacrament specifically or maybe merely a contract. And that's a whole separate connection. But the whole thing is, those are the only sacraments you can do without an ordained priesthood. You want to have the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, divinity of Christ. But here you had some bread and some wine. If you're doing what you're supposed to do as a priest, you're actually ordained as a priest. You're saying the right words as a priest. You intend to do what the church normally does in this. And you're using actually bread and wine of certain description. You're not using Oreo cookies or something and so forth. You have, when you've done all this, the body, blood, soul, divinity of Christ. That is by Christ's own promises. He didn't say this as he held up the bread. He didn't say this means my body or this represents my body or all of you sitting around here eating this together are my body. He held up bread and he said, this is my body. So even as his body's there, it's also his body. And really just as literally as the flesh, you could have cut off his arm right then if you thought to do it. So it's his body and blood, just as any piece of flesh would have blood. And conversely, blood has something of the body in the form of the blood corpuscles, etc. So they're always kind of mixed together anyway. But so you have the body, you have the blood of Christ. And with that, also, as the church is taught from how far back, that includes the soul divinity of Christ. So, but if any of those things is wrong, the guy says something else, but he's not supposed to say. He just says the wrong thing. Or he uses Oreo cookies and, well, let's bring up Coca-Cola again. Sorry, Coke, I don't want to blame you. I'm just throwing it out here as an example. Or if he's just pretending to do this, but he doesn't really intend, and that's a little harder to document. And so if any of these things are wrong, you just end up with the same wine and bread or whatever you've used that you started out with. The sacrament didn't work. You do not have the body, blood, soul, divinity of Christ. You just have a piece of, hopefully at least bread, and hopefully at least wine. Just like when you started.
One other thing you claim in the book, that the Vatican leaders are not real popes, and yet you accept Catholics, those who think he is. Why and how can you explain that? That question's confusing.
That's a good question, yes, and I appreciate that. Because here's the thing. To understand what is a Catholic pope, one has to be rather conversant in a lot of things that, well, face it, most people are just not. First, you'd have to, how do you even evaluate if somebody's a pope? Because everybody thinks he is. Up until Vatican II, that was generally good enough. Now, there's been other various popes at various times in the world, and so forth. Novacius, I think, started something where he kind of made himself a pope. There's, I think, the Ethiopian church has somebody they call a pope, and I mean, there's various other popes. Maybe you hear the expression of the Black Pope is some satanic figure. I mean, okay, there's various popes in the world, but usually when people think of pope, that would be simply a pope, which is supposed to mean a successor of the Apostle Peter. Now, what does it take to evaluate whether somebody is a successor of the Apostle Peter? Or more appropriately, when do you know that this is a question? It is a question when he's doing things that are outside the parameters. A pope is said to be, and this is Catholic doctrine, confirmed at the First Vatican Council, by the way, but it's obviously been believed, but now they just officially confirmed it then, that a pope is infallible. That means if he's teaching the whole church on a subject of faith and morals and clearly intending to impose, this is what the church always believes and must always believe, whatever it is he says they're supposed to believe will be. And that is made so, regardless of whether the man has thought it through or not. It's a sin, though, if he hasn't, researched it out, but he'll still say something right, because that's the power of the Holy Ghost. Keeping, honoring the protection that God has made to his church. So if you find somebody who can say something that clearly contradicts what popes have already confirmed is dogmatically true, that is something a real pope cannot do. If somehow he would lose his state of being the papacy if he could do that. And it remains to be seen whether that's even possible. I don't even know the answer to that. Theologians disagree and always have. But clearly, once he's teaching stuff that contradicts what the church has always taught for almost 2,000 years now, that in and of itself evidences that somehow, and it doesn't tell us how, why, or when, but somehow this man has failed to become a pope, or else he has somehow lost his claim to the papacy if he had ever received it. And that is inescapable. Problem is, a lot of people, this is a lot of theology. You got to be read up on theology and know the sources well to understand all these things, to understand what he's contradicting. Because if you don't know what he's contradicting, it's like, well, he says, well, it sounds good to me. I don't just, that's not enough to go by. And then here's the other thing, is that if he's the Pope, he's got to be protected. If he's not the Pope, he's going to be not, he can say anything he wants, like all the rest of us. If I wanted to teach that little green men from Mars are the real, we're the real Jesus, the Holy Spirit is going to stop me. But the Holy Spirit would stop a Pope from saying a nutty thing like that. So that's kind of the difference. Now, I'm trying to think. So what about the ordinary person there? They don't know all this stuff. They don't know how to evaluate that. But they don't want to go, they think it's like a matter of judging people. You don't want to go judging people. That's not a nice thing to do. Judge not, that you shall not be judged. That's in the Bible. But does that mean we just can't judge? We just got to, he calls himself a pope. We have to believe everything he says like he's a pope, even though he tells us stuff that we've already learned is not true in our catechisms when we were growing up. You see what I mean? people don't know the rules. And if they haven't studied those rules, and it's not out in all the basic catechisms, you see, you don't see that in just ordinary, the Baltimore Catechism is going to tell you how to detect if somebody is or isn't, has somehow failed to be a pope. It's not going to go into that because for 1900 years, that at least was not a problem. Even when we had multiple claimants to the papacy who were ultimately, even though they weren't real popes, what they led was still parts of the church because they were able to come back together. We have that in the first Western Schism. Huh. So what it comes down to is individual Catholics aren't all called to be theologians. You not only have a soul to save, but a family to feed, and it's maybe all we can do just to do that much and to try to live a pious, upright life. And that, at least, we should be able to discern from the holiness of what a real Latin Mass is all about. It's not just the language, it's the content of the prayer, all of the rubrics, the way it's all done. All of that adds up to something that made it really something fundamentally different, a different religion from what you find in your local St. Miscellaneouses today.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
There you go.
So that's what it is. Yeah.
So, what do you want people to come away with as we round out the show? What do you want people to come away with in understanding what your book is and the message you're trying to send to people?
The message is, if you're interested in being a Catholic and saving your soul the way Jesus Christ founded the church to help everyone to do, what you really should try to do is the easiest is to find a Latin Mass. Now, there may be parts of the world where there's other rites of the church, the Byzantine rite, Ukrainian rite, and so on. And sometimes the challenges are somewhat different. I talk about that a little bit too, but I know I'd have to have a great deal more familiarity, first of all, with these rites in their traditional forms, and then with what has happened to them since Vatican II. They clearly have been compromised in some ways, and some of them in a lot of ways, and others maybe not quite so much. It's a tough call, and I kind of have to say that much in my book. But what you look for is a Mass that you can see what it is. It's not always said in Latin, but it's really the original Latin prayers that were being used. Even if you can't hear what they're saying, in fact, you won't hear a lot of what they say, you have your missal that you can look at, and it'll tell you everything. And you can tell if what they're doing is saying that or something else, because the whole rhythm of what they do will be off or different if you're not using the right Roman missal, a real one versus, say, what we call a Novus Ordo, New Order one. So that's what you should try to do. There is a directory where you can find that. Mm-hmm. And that directory would be, if you go online, it would be at Traditio, TRADITIO.com. It's the oldest traditional Catholic website on the whole internet. They actually founded that in September 29, 1994, before I even really came along. So this is by a priest from a long time ago, but it's still there, and it's maintained as various, true Latin Masses get added or taken away, and you just look for what's near you. And if you're in a different country that has contact information, if you're in this country, here's somebody to call, and so on, or contact. So one way or another, you can hopefully get a Mass and so forth. And there's other things you can do if it's still harder, and I talk about that. But the point is, you try to find the real faith. Start with old, real catechisms, for example. Not the new catechisms are full of fuzz and blur, and you never know. But basically, pre-1960, I should say, should be safe enough.
There you go. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. Give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Okay. Well, as I said, look for Mr. Ubi Petrus on the YouTube. Is probably the best and easiest way to find me. I think that's probably the easiest to do right now, because, like I said, I don't have a lot of other sites. I really have never figured out Twitter or X or whatever, Facebook. A lot of those things are kind of confusing to me. I'm kind of this old fogey who can't really quite get with all these new programs, Instagram. I don't know these things that well. maybe someday I might try to learn them, but I'm not very good at that. I spent a lot of my time just digging through history, and I had to track down lots of sources. And this is mostly a history book. Once the history actually gets going, it's history.
Okay.
And it's history, and then the other book will drill it into the theology. It's a whole different thing, but that's another thing, and we'll talk about that later.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold. It's called The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, a guide to the traditional Catholic community. Out September 26, 2002, but I believe this is the 2019 updated version. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's been through a few updates, and some events have happened that history's like that. In fact, some more history's happened, and I'll have to revise it again one of these times and bring in later history and so forth. So, yeah, there's been some revisions, and it's interesting that a book that's been around so long is still selling, because this is not about me or my life or my journey. That doesn't even come in here. This is about everyone's journey.
Okay.
Especially
all right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
thank you.
We got it. All right.
And thanks, man, for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1, the TikTok, and all those crazy places on the internet. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the most amazing, intelligent podcast ever made to improve your brain and your life. Warning, consuming too much of the Chris Voss Show podcast can lead to people thinking you're smarter, younger, and irresistible sexy. Consume in regularly moderated amounts. Consult a doctor for any resulting brain bleed.